So, have you been wondering how to expand your consulting or coaching business beyond just one on one client work and build a course or program or something else that people will pay you for? We'll find out how to go about doing this on today's episode of the Consulting Matters podcast with my guest, Calvin Williams, who did exactly that. And welcome to the Consulting Matters podcast. This is the show for purpose driven consultants and coaches who are ready to own the power of what they do and position themselves for greater impact and income. I'm your host, Betsy Jordan. I'm both a business mentor and a brand messaging and positioning strategist. You can find out how I help my clients turn the complexity of what they do and all their ideas into clear and compelling client converting messages, offers, and strategies on my website at www.betsyjordan.com. And don't forget, Jordan is with a Y, not an A. So, today on the show, we're going to get into how to turn your consulting or coaching expertise into a product, a program, or technology that people will pay you for. And we're going to begin this conversation with getting real about why you might want to do this in the first place. So, maybe you're tired of the grind of constantly trying to find clients or doing one on one work. So, you're looking for more scale, bigger impact, or maybe even just passive revenue. But what most people don't fully understand or appreciate that switching from a service-based business to a product-based business isn't a little tweak. It's a total transformation that changes everything. Not just your offers, but your marketing, your messaging, your value proposition, your entire path to scale. So this shift totally doable and can be massively rewarding if it's right for you and if it's done right. To help us make sense of what it really takes, I'm excited to bring onto the show Calvin Williams. So he's an industrial engineer turned operations and continuous improvement leader, turned successful consulting business owner. And now he's taken his consulting business and he's turned it into what he does now. And he's the executive leader at Improver, which is a subscription based software that helps companies develop continuous improvement culture. So, in our conversation, we get into both his journey from leadership to consulting business owner, as well as his journey from traditional consulting into the product and technology business he runs now. So, because of we're looking at it from both sides, you're going to get real world insights into what it takes to turn not just the best of your career, but your true strengths and passions into the right business for you. Well, welcome to the show, Calvin. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm excited as well. Appreciate you having me on, Betsy.
Well, I think you and I met, well, like a month or 2 ago over our shared passion for ROI and my latest passion around lean. And I do really want to get into the conversation about how you moved your business into the product base, but I have to start off with your background in lean and like how you got there. You started as an industrial engineer and you fell into lean, or like tell me a little bit about your background before you got into entrepreneurship.
Okay, so I'll start with my college experience and then kind of get into, the lean part of my story. So, I went to University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I actually went there on a track and field scholarship. So, got an opportunity to run with Eric Crouch and Bobby Newcomb and some of the, famous Huskers that came through the program. They also ran track, so that was a lot of fun. But got into industrial engineering while I was there, and probably 3 years into my, academic career, let's call it that. uh, Track and IE became a lot, so decided to just focus on academics and got into the program. A few years in, they introduced us to Lean and Six Sigma, and they gave us the opportunity to get certified. Now, I didn't take the opportunity then, but I think the seed was planted to, yeah, that's something you definitely want to look into later. So, couple years into my career, went to go work for Tyson Foods right out of college. Went to go work for Nestle. Actually started working on my Lean Six Sigma certs at Nestle. Tyson was in a weird place where they were nuts and bolts IE, right? It was almost all time studies and big, huge manual labor force, and they wanted to drive efficiencies, process improvements, and that kind of thing, but they weren't necessarily going all in on lean and Six Sigma, that kind of thing. So I said, you know what, after about 3 years of, really fundamental IE stuff, I said, let me go work for a company that's a little more serious about the continuous improvement stuff, right? Because I was, wanting to go that way. So took a role with Nestle as a performance improvement engineer, and that was my okay. So let me give you the backstory. So I was working there for probably 6 months, right? And corporate came in and said, "Hey, we got a process. We want to try to reduce changeover times across the network, and we think you guys have a lot of opportunities. Let's do this changeover training for a bunch of people, and after that, we'll see if we can apply some of this stuff." Right? So that was probably 30 people in the changeover training course, and I just loved it. I loved every minute of it. It made so much sense to me. It was just so intuitive. Thinking back, I think I was a lean person from birth. I just didn't know the language, didn't know the tools, but that came later, right? So I took up the mantle after corporate left. I went to my bosses and said, "Hey, you guys mind if I actually do something with this, newfound knowledge that they gave us?" And they were like, sure, but don't let it interfere with your day job." So it was like, go ahead and do continuous improvement, but do it on your own time. We're not going to pay you to do it, is what they're saying, essentially, right? So me being me, I was like, okay, yeah, well, great opportunity. I'm gonna take it. And I end up over the next 6 weeks applying a bunch of the SMED stuff, applying Gantt charts and a lot of the tools from the Lean toolbox. And we end up reducing change over time by about 36% in about a month and a half time frame. And the same folks that were like, go ahead, Calvin, do that on your own time, they became the anytime somebody came to the plant, anytime they wanted to impress a visitor, this was the first thing they showed off. Look at what we did with changeover times. We did this, right? So- and I would just be sitting back like, yeah, we did it. We sure did, didn't we? But that was my foray into it. The plant, I think, became a lot more convinced, and they turned up their lean and CI activity after that. It sort of started to spread throughout the network. I end up winning the Nestle Very Best award in that year. I think I came in second place throughout the entire 50 something plant network for the best led Kaizen project. And that was my jump start. And it's been full speed ever since.
So I hear the seeds of why we have our shared passion around ROI.
Yeah.
It's like you showed the ROI and then you got the support. So I really love that. For those who are listening who don't know the difference between industrial engineer and Lean Six Sigma, process improvement, continuous improvement, can you like quickly just describe the difference between those two disciplines
Yeah.
and why you feel like what you were able to get better results from this approach that you were taking, the continuous improvement.
The way I look at it is CI is a subset of industrial engineering. So industrial engineering is older and it's broader. In fact, a lot of the IE stuff and even some of the I guess some of the lean stuff too came from was more formalized back when Henry Ford was building the Ford Motor Company, right? With the continuous flow assembly line, with standard work, simplifying the work so that the training curve, the learning curve was much shorter, that kind of thing. So time studies, statistical analysis, a lot of that came with the development of industrial engineering. And when you think of IE, think of the industrial revolutions, right? All of the industrial revolutions is in a sense engineering industries to make them more efficient, do more with less. That's what it really comes down to. And um, all of the industrial revolutions we had up to now are really energy revolutions, meaning energy is more abundant, so we can do more, right? With less money, less resources. So that's IE. Now, continuous improvement, lean, and some of the other principles came out of industrial engineering. So what happened was Deming and maybe Schuhart and those guys studied at Ford, kind of made sense of what Ford was doing. I think they applied a little more of the scientific thinking to kind of what they were learning here in America. And then they took that to Japan after World War II and they took it into Toyota. And Toyota sort of looked at some of these concepts and simplified them down to, the scientific approach, right? PDCA, PDSA, whatever you want to call it. And they said, all right, let's take that kernel and apply it everywhere, right? So they sort of brought almost an art, almost a obsessive discipline to the idea of applying scientific thinking across the whole business, the way the business operates. And from that came Lean, the Toyota production system, all the things you see visually, visual management, the 5S and 5 Ys, and even Hoshin Conry, all of that came from the same kernel of let's run our business in a more scientific way, which came from industrial engineering. So yeah, yeah, and that's the concept. And the challenge that a lot of companies now, lean is becoming a global phenomena. I think I would say maybe past becoming, I would say it is a global phenomena. The challenge that a lot of companies run into is that while you can go in and train frontline people, middle managers on lean and CI and all that, it's really the upper leaders who have the power to implement and sustain and make it work. So there's a lot of focus right now on how leadership should support this type of transformation, the application of scientific approach to the way the business operates.
So it's, like, it's really interesting, I'm so late to the game on understanding lean because I thought of lean for all these years of, like, just as process people, and then as you're talking about it as, like, scientific thinking and then the whole management approach and this whole discipline, it's really different, and I think that that's part of the challenge that a lot of us consultants have is, like, we're all in our little world, like, or even coaches have it, and we're all in our little world, and, like, we get it, and it all makes sense, and it's like, "Why does everybody not get it?" I don't know if you experienced that as an internal person, it seems like you were able to proactively advocate, like, I wanna create this type of value within the organization, and you were able to build the career, that way. Tell me a little bit about your journey from, like, having that formal role within an organization to starting your own consulting business. Like, when did you leave a organization and start a consulting business?
All right, some point along the way, I think I've always been entrepreneurial in thought and always wanted to build and run my own business. I think I was like shoveling snow door to door from 9 years old growing up in South Chicago. So I've always had a little bit of a hustler's mentality, right? Go get it, go make it happen, step out of your comfort zone, do what you can to capitalize on what you have, right? Um, so I think even going into my first job, I mentioned my first job was at Tyson Foods back in '04, '05 timeframe, right? And even going into that, I already had like a music record label going in college and other, hustles. So I've always had that in me, right? It wasn't anything new when the time came. It's just, I guess I had to get some other things in position before I could make the leap, officially from corporate. So, um, but I also started to realize that a lot of the barriers I was running into to affect the kind of change that I wanted to see was internal politics. It was, you know, people playing these games of, "Oh, you're not out here on the floor with us every day um and dealing with the crisis of the moment, you're not a team player and therefore, you know, maybe we shouldn't help you as much either, right? It was that kind of stuff, like internal politics, right? I realized that I could potentially be more effective outside the company than I can being an internal employee. And I mean, lean industrial engineering to some extent is a consultant's game, right? The original people who came out of Toyota with lean were academics and were consultants. They weren't internal employees doing this, right? Taiichi Ono was, somewhat of an internal lean driver and TPS driver, but then, the consultants went in and studied Toyota and came out and said, "Hey, we got this thing. It's called lean. Everybody should do it," right? And then it became a huge consulting gang, right? Got the Shingajitsu consultants. You got, everybody, everybody who could was jumping into that to play that game and did well for themselves for the most part. So um, now the thing about a consultant is traditionally a consultant's going to go in, assess the situation, and maybe leave a task list task list of things to do in order to get the results that are being projected also. Um, so me kind of my foray from corporate into independent actually had a pit stop at a top tier management consulting firm called AT Kearney. So I went to Kearney for about 2 years. And I'll tell you something incredible is that we were doing project work. I was a little older than a lot of the other consultants, right? At my same, seniority level. So I knew better what to do and how to do it than most of the people on the project teams that I was on, even better than the manager. right? So I had more experience, more natural inclination, more talent, right, in that specific thing, right? But I also recognized that they were selling, I don't know if I should say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. They were selling the billing rate was like $5,000 a day for me and the people on my team, each person, right? This was when I was there, it's like 2012, 2013 timeframe, something like that. The number's gone up since then though, right? So I'm like, 5 grand a day, me being the entrepreneur I am, is thinking, wow, I could do great with half of that. I mean, give me a fraction of that and I'm doing great, right? Living a great life. So, that was always sort of in the bouncing around in the back of my head. So after working for Carney and learning the business for a couple years, decided, you know what, I'm going to go for it, right? I'm gonna start my own practice, and I started a company called Manufacturing Consulting to help small mid-sized manufacturing companies with operational excellence.
So what is interesting and I hear thematically in your background is you're an entrepreneur by nature. Like that's just your personality. And
Yeah.
it seems like as an entrepreneur, like to me, like an entrepreneur is not just somebody like there's the archetype of an entrepreneur and then there's the position of of an entrepreneur. Like the archetype of
Mm.
an entrepreneur, I think you and I are alike, is like we're always going to be inventing something because we see something that other people don't see and we have to like
Hmm.
manifest it. You know, like
Yeah.
so you were an entrepreneur, you were an entrepreneur as a young kid and then in college, but then you became an entrepreneur. And then even leaving, it was like, okay, I think I can create more value. So it's like, okay, I'm going to step outside. And then even as you're in this firm, and it's like, well, I could do this. You know, I have a vision. So I'm going to go out and do that, which I think is really unique because a lot of people, when they actually leave the security of a 9 to 5, if for a lot of people, it's like they kind of have to be pushed out of the nest. You're one of the few people like you kick the nest behind and it's like, all right, I'm going to keep flying and I'm going to go from there.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah. I would
that's
have I
unique
would have
to
never
you.
I would have never got in the nest if it was totally up to me.
Yeah, because you got it, you're independent.
Yeah.
You know, in that way. So, I think that
Yeah.
that's probably a big part of, like it's making me realize, like, I know a big part of our conversation is gonna be around how you took your consulting business into a product-based business, but what
Mm.
I'm kind of imagining is this is not going to be the final end. There's gonna be probably several other iterations that Calvin's going to have, and I'm also seeing thematically that you like putting a couple names together and making something new. So, your consulting
Mm.
business was Magnificent or what was it? Like magnificent and
Manufacturing.
manufacturing together. So
Yeah.
that's unique to you as well.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so for our people who don't have this entrepreneurial kind of like, long-term kind of drive, could you just give lessons or insights or best practices from just what it means to leave the security and start your own business if they don't have the wiring that you do? Like, what could you recommend? What
Mm.
suggestions would you make of somebody who's at that place in their consulting career
Alright, so let's go with the assumption that they're going into a consulting business because,
or a
you learn a
coaching
lot in
business? It
corporate.
could be a
They
coaching.
or coaching, right? Because you learn so much in manufacturing or whatever, logistics, supply chain, healthcare, whatever. You learn so much that there's
OD,
so many ways you can spin
HR.
off.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, let's just assume, like lean consulting, right? If you're gonna step off, I think the way I did it was a great way to do it is to go work for an existing firm that already knew what they were doing and take great notes, right? Obviously, you're gonna be working with clients and you need to service those clients to the best of your ability, do excellent work, of course, but also study the go to market, right? How do they market? How do they sell? How do they package a product? How do they package a service? How do they price and things like that, right? Understand the full 360 spectrum of the business. Now, as an independent though, right, you're not gonna operate like a big company. You're gonna do all the functions, finance, sales, um, service at a much smaller scale. So you can't go to market as an individual or a small team thinking you're gonna play like a big player, right? So, kind of keep those things in perspective. Um, so ideally, yeah, start by working for a company that's already doing exactly what you want to do and then sort of learn the game from them, right? There's some companies that do non-compete and things like that. Keep that in mind. You want to steer clear of any type of legal problems, right? But then save up some money. I'm gonna say save up about a year's worth of expenses. And in fact, if you can get your expenses as low as possible before you jump the ship, do that, right? Reduce your expenses to the bare minimum to take care of your business at home, right? And then save up, if you can, do a year, right? Because you may think you're gonna step off and then business is just gonna come rolling in. It never happens like that, right? It may take you a while before you land your first project like myself. I think it took all of 7 or 8 months before I got my first project. And before I had left, I had 5 or 6 commitments for projects from senior level executives saying, "We're gonna do something, we're just waiting on, some funds to get cleared up or waiting on the budget or whatever it is, and then we're gonna do it." I had 5 or 6, so I thought I was good. A month or 2 after I left and started my own practice, all 5 or 6 vanished into thin air. So now I'm scrambling like I gotta build a business from scratch, really, right? So, um, yeah, if you can secure projects, try to do that and uh, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Plan for any prior commitments from friends and network and all that to not go through. Plan to be able to basically hit the streets and build business from the ground up. And one of
I
the
re
first things I did, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
No, I really like what you're doing is, like, you're managing expectations. Like, instead of, like, waving the "You too can make $1,000,000, consulting, your first year," like, you're making it more realistic of you're just really managing expectations. Like, so I just wanna summarize what I'm hearing you say, and then I wanna add on to it. Like, one thing it sounds like is a really good best practice is go, go to work for a firm and learn what you can, but go in with the expectation that I'm not doing this forever. 'Cause I think a lot of people leave their job and then they go and subcontract with somebody else, and they don't really have it as, like, I'm doing it as a pit stop rather than this like, it becomes their destination. So then they get caught in this subcontractor trap rather than, "I know this is gonna be a pit stop. I'm here to learn, to build my skills, and that's kinda it." And so it's fine that I'm making less than what they're charging the client, but I'm not gonna stay stuck here. So I really like that as managing that part of the expectation. The other part is a lot of people get like feel like, "Oh, I have to make this amount of money to live the lifestyle that I'm used to living as a corporate leader," rather than like, you don't actually have to live that lifestyle. You can actually reduce expenses. Like, you could downsize your house. You can do other kinds of things to even reduce your pressure on how much money you need to earn because you don't have to have the huge house. You could have a less house. You could have less expenses. And I think that's another way that you can manage your expenses. And then the third part of what I heard you say is have money in the bank because you just need to go in and say, just because I build it, they're not magically going to come. Like I'm going to have to go and do stuff and I have no idea how long it'll take. So those are three really good best practices slash managing your expectations that I think is really helpful and that I think will really change things for a lot of people. And I want you to add on because I know I interrupted you, but I wanted to make sure because those were really good points and I didn't want to lose your key points. So like we could add a fourth one if there's the fourth one of what you would recommend.
No, I think you're hitting on it. I think anybody who's got that entrepreneurial spirit is not necessarily seeking comfort. And like you said, people fall into that comfort trap. And they say, I'm gonna sit here, I'm gonna learn enough, I'm gonna be competent at my job, and I'm gonna stay here forever. That's seeking comfort. I think an entrepreneur isn't necessarily seeking comfort as much as they're seeking freedom. And yeah, freedom and building wealth and building a legacy and having no limit, no glass ceiling, right? You go as far as your talent and your skills can take you, right? That's kind of, I think that's the mindset. And I think that kind of person doesn't necessarily run toward the security blanket of a job and a salary,
I
right?
think that
So if
some
you're
do. Like, say I think that
yeah,
it's like a lot of people leave the corporate environment because it's like, I want control over my career. I want control over my earning power. I want control over my time. Like, I want those things. But at the same time, it's like the hustle that you seem to have a resonance with it. It's like that's part of the fun, is like figuring
Mhm.
this out. Like somehow in your
Right.
mindset, it's like this is part of the journey. This is fun. Figuring this out is fun. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, like getting on there marketing myself. Like so then
Mhm.
it's like I'm gonna retreat from my goals by subcontracting. Subcontracting, as you could tell, makes me batty because people are at this level in an organization, then you go subcontract and you make less. But I think it's like it's
Mm,
avoiding the marketing, and I think that there is something about
mhm,
like, maybe we change it different from the word hustle because the hustle has a bad connotation, but it's just kind of like the
yeah.
challenge of getting out there, finding clients that you seem to be okay with, like, that it's fun, it's energizing, figuring it out. Like, what would you encourage people to have that mindset? It's like, it's fun figuring it out. Maybe it's your continuous
Mm.
improvement background as well to have more of that like embracing, like what would you encourage people to do around embracing the whole marketing, business development, and all the things that so many consultants and coaches hate?
I'm gonna say something about subcontracting. Okay, subcontracting is not a terrible way to get from full time employee to independent. It's a good transition window. But
Yeah,
if you really want to reach your potential, to your point, you got to pick up the marketing and sales. There's no way around it, right? Maybe you don't like cold calling. I don't like cold calling, but it's a necessary evil because what I do like is worth so much more than avoiding the thing I don't like, right? So there's a saying that says that a fool recognizes the cost of everything and the value of nothing. So if you can see the value in those cold calls, but you can also see the costs, which is annoyance, it's a lot of rejection, it's time consuming. You wait it too and say, you know what, if I can land a, six-figure client and it takes me 2 weeks of cold calling to do it, even 2 months of cold calling to do it, hell, it's worth it, right? It's worth the pain to get to the prize. So yeah, I think you gotta have a certain tolerance for pain to
yeah.
to do it.
Or
And
the vulnerability. Like, to me, it's like, it's not even the pain,
yeah,
it's just the vulnerability putting yourself out there. I'll push
the
back with you on
humility.
the cold calling thing is I never do
Yeah.
cold calling. In all of my years as a consultant and what I do now, like, there's 1,000 ways that you can get clients, and you don't
It's
have to
true.
do
It's
things
true.
that you don't like. Like, most of my clients come from creating content. I had content from the beginning when I launched my business 15 years ago. I had videos, I had my YouTube, I had my blog. Like, I had clients come to me through that, but that was a stretch at the beginning. Like, I remember when my web guy who I was working with, and he was a web guy slash mentor, and he was, like, telling me, like, "You need to have, like you're gonna go and make videos, you're gonna write blogs." I'm like, "Ah, like, I'm not gonna do it." And he's like, "Yes, you are." And he just told me, "You're gonna do it." I pushed myself outside of my comfort zone, and I love creating content. Like, if I were gonna strip everything away from my business and it's like I had to, like, leave nothing left, like, let's just say I had to pick the one thing I would only do, I would create content. I love content.
That's it.
Not that
Yeah.
well,
And
I love working with my clients, but I still love content, and I think that that's the other thing too, is you don't have to do what everybody else does, you can still chart your
it's
own
true.
path.
It's true. So you're making a fair point. I mentioned cold calling because it's the most miserable thing, and to make a point that sometimes you got to do stuff you don't want to do, but you should do what you're great at, right? If you're great at creating content and that works for you and you enjoy it, do that and go crazy with it. And but you got to do it, right? If you're not good at creating content, you don't like the way you sound, don't like the way you look, don't like what you create, you got to find another way. But um there is a way for everybody, right? Even if it's I think authenticity is part of the equation too, right? You got to do what you're naturally inclined to do. Um
And do it in a
but
way that works for you. Like, even like, let's just unpack the cold calling thing because I think that's what makes people have
yeah.
anxiety attacks about this whole thing. You don't have to be like one of those people on LinkedIn who, like they like you could see them a mile away. Like they pretend that they want to connect with you, but they really don't want to connect with you. They just want to sell you.
Mm,
Well, you don't have to be that kind of person. Go on
for sure.
LinkedIn, find somebody who's interesting and actually develop a relationship and then see if there's a partnership opportunity. You don't have to do it in the way that makes your stomach turn. Like, you don't have to
Mhm.
do it that way. You can forge your own path.
It's true. Yeah, you don't have to spam, and in fact, you shouldn't spam people in any way, right? Whether that's calls, direct messages on LinkedIn, emails, right? Spamming is bad. Okay. And it's not smart either. It doesn't work. Like people don't like it. You turn more people off and you can ruin your reputation that way. So um I guess the mentality you gotta have is value first. And I see what you do and I see you have that mentality. I have that mentality. I've honed it over time, but value, value, value. And then when it's time to call in a favor, it's a lot less, it's received a lot better by your prospect.
And really understanding the value of what you're doing, because if you know, like, hey, if I'm clear on my value and I know it's going to create an ROI, like you did back at Tyson or Nestle, where you were initiated and they said do it on your own time. You're like, I know I can create value here. Like once you see it, it's like then you can't unsee it, and then you can continue on. Let's talk about your transition from, so you started with traditional consulting and working with organizations working on product on projects, and then you made the move into improver or improvers with an S. I think I call it
Improver.
improver. Yeah.
Yeah, it's improver. Yeah.
Another fun word that you smushed together into, that, but what made you, what, like, was there, like, a moment that you're like, "Huh, I should probably create a product?" Like, what made you decide to say, "I wanna move from traditional consulting into, I wanna create a product and technology," and tell us a little bit about, like, where you were and then what you decided to invent at that particular moment.
All right, so about a year into this consultancy I created called Manufacient, I realized that I did not like the feast and famine nature of consulting, right? Where while you're not on a project, of course, you're chasing your next project. While you're on a project, you're not really chasing your next project. So you might do well on a project, right? It might give you some runway, 8, 9 months or whatever it is, 6 months. But then you spend that time chasing your next project, but always anxious about whether or not it's going to come on time, right? So that's I realized I didn't really like that. I had some pretty good tech acumen. I actually had started a tech company back in 2009 called Excelville, and it was a spreadsheet marketplace because I was, pretty good at spreadsheets. I can build spreadsheets to be like fully functional software, right? So I was like, let me create a marketplace. Let me offer my spreadsheets, but let others upload and offer theirs too, right? And that did okay. It did okay, not great, but it did okay. It sustained itself plus a little more. But I had one spreadsheet that really, really, really sold like crazy. And it was a OEE downtime tracking and that kind of spreadsheet, right? Where you could track your line stoppages and efficiencies and that kind of thing on a manufacturing floor. So I started saying, okay, instead of having this whole Excelville platform when really this one thing is just rocking and rolling, why don't I create a software that does solves two problems for me? One, I really emphasize or drill in on the functionality of this spreadsheet and build it into a real software product. And two, I can get to a subscription based cash flow that we get paid a subscription and get out of this feast and famine, sort of payment model that I'm in as a consultant, right? So I started building Improver. It was called FOS First Factory Operating System. Terrible branding, terrible name. But then, Maria, my co-founder, wife and co-founder, got together and said, we need to come up with something that works for this. We started thinking through options, landed on I think it was called I think it was like improvement.com or something close. And then we got to improvers.com, right? And the thought behind improver.com. And the thought behind improver is that the people who would use our software are improvers. And the people who would become part of our community are improvers. So we're calling the software this, but we're really branding the user. We're branding the person we want to become part of this thing we're doing. Um, so it's kind of a double branding exercise to brand two things at one. And in doing so, we're organically building a community of improvers. Like, are you an improver? If you are, you should be with us. You should be using this product. You should be part of our community, right? So, um, and I think a lot of people would identify themselves as improvers, right? People who drive cultures of continuous improvement.
So you started with that one spreadsheet, but now I know you have a certification program that you offer. You have tons of other types of tools to help somebody with everything that they need in order to lead that kind of lean transformation. Like, how did you go from the spreadsheet to the full suite?
Okay, so this is a whole like go to market journey for us. So this is a journey that's 9, 10 years in the making, right? So we went to market with that OEE tool, and it just tracks like line efficiencies and all that, right? We started getting connected with Silicon Valley, understanding like the tech world a little more, and at the same time, we're trying to convince manufacturers to use our product. And I got to give a shout out to Troy Magruder and a few folks at uh, WTI World Technology Ingredients in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. I got to give a shout out to Damon Nix at the Georgia MEP for plugging us in with our first customer who started using the product, started getting great results, gave us all the feedback we needed to refine it, make it a better product, and that kind of thing. This was back in 2017, 2018 timeframe, I believe. Maybe 2019, but somewhere in there, right? And from that, we learned that okay, just people using OEE um, is not enough, really, right? They also need some coaching to coach them into the thinking process that goes behind OEE and how to see the data and how to assess what to do with the data and all that. So we started getting again some of that consulting came back in the form of coaching, right? Um, I was always a fan of coaching. I was always a fan of Toyota Kata, PDCA, and all that. But so later, the next iteration of our product was to sort of transition out of just OEE by itself. The other side of that was there's a bunch of great OEE products out on the market. So we're entering a competitive market, and we're early. They're very mature. We needed to pivot. So we pivoted toward more of the coaching model, PDCA style coaching model, like Toyota Kata, right? Toyota Kata is like, hey, what's your target condition? What's your current state? What obstacles are there? What have you tried? What you learned from it? What you're going to try next? It's a very, very simple and structured coaching model. So we started moving that way. And in doing so, we started realizing, okay, people like Kata is usually like a one-off person in the company picks it up, takes it, likes it, does things with it, but they can't really scale it. They can't get other people to take it up. They can't get other people to take it seriously. They can't get it's sort of dependent on a coach being there. And if the coach is not active or good, then it falls apart, right? So it's got a bunch of dependencies. Um, so we started realizing that in order for companies to really take up PDCA from top to bottom in that time frame, I wrote a book called Fit: The Simple Science of Achieving Strategic Goals. It was a number one seller on Amazon for like 11 to 12 weeks in about four categories. It's still out there if you want to check it out. Um, so we started thinking like we need to educate people. We need to get people to understand why they should be doing this and the impact it can have and that kind of thing. So we started doing that. We started selling books. We built a course. We built the Improver University to launch that course, Agile Strategy Execution, which is part of the book. The book talks a lot about that. Um, but then we started realizing that, these people that are buying our product and taking it up and trying to get started, they fall off after a few months. And our diagnosis is the reason that they're falling off is that they don't really have a good thorough foundational understanding of continuous improvement in general. So then we started developing the all the training courses that would go into Lean Six Sigma certification, started organizing those courses in terms of belts. Um, then we started taking that to market, and we found a lot more companies taking interest in getting their people certified. And that actually helped our other software product, which is the platform, the coaching and the PDCA platform to do a lot better, brought a lot more value. Um, since then, we've said, you know what? If they're learning all these other lean tools and all this, then they should be able to use those tools in the platform also. So we built a low code, no code tool builder so that we could build or our users could build custom tools, just about any tool you can think of. Five Whys, Demaic, value stream mapping, SciPoc, you name it, and then they can essentially deploy those tools within that same, PDCA framework. We also added the DMAIC framework, so everything's there now, right? So you got both sides. You got the university to learn it, and then the platform to apply it.
It feels like your business success is based on your philosophy around continuous improvement anyway. Like it feels like when you hit a situation where it's like, okay, it's like, let's say if we were going to go all the way back to like when you were in the organization, then you went to the consulting and then you started your own consulting business, is it feels like you're this like kind of person where it's like, okay, I'm going to try this out. And if this doesn't feel well, like I'm not going to double down on what's not working for me or what I don't really enjoy. I'm just going to keep figuring it out and keep moving. So even though you were in your consulting business, you weren't in it that long that when you decided to make a move, because it sounds like you didn't double down over like what didn't feel like it was working for you. Like you didn't want the feast or famine. It wasn't going to work for you. You weren't doubling down. That's like, oh, I guess this is my lot in life that I have to be feast or famine guy in order to make this thing work. So, and then it's instead of like, I have to figure out the whole kit and caboodle of like exactly what all this is I'll take this one tool that seems to be doing well, build that, get the feedback, listen, improve, and then add to it. And then you just continue to add. And I think that's why, like, there's probably 12 other iterations for you. It's like continuous improvement is not what you teach, it's what you live. And that's your approach to your business development, is
Bingo.
what I'm
You said it.
hearing.
You said it better than I could say it myself. So it starts with critical thinking, right? Or it starts with an ambition, knowing what you want to do, where you want to be, right? Having some idea of vision for yourself and your place in the world, right? And then thinking critically every step of the way and saying, all right, I tried something. This little piece of it worked, the rest of it didn't. Right. And this part over here made things worse, actually. So let me just scrap this part that made things worse and see if I can double down on what is working. Right. And then sort of just routinely iterate all the way to, until you achieve success. So yeah, I mean, if you study Toyota Kata, it's like, what's your challenge? What's your long term view? What's your current state? And then what's your short term view? What's your next target condition? Right? It's the same mindset, right? For me, I think it was natural because I remember being in high school on the track team and saying to myself, I want to high jump 7 feet. That's what I want to do. I could jump. I knew I could jump high, but 7 feet is kind of absurd, right? For like a freshman in high school. So I would just constantly critically break down my form, my technique, my approach, my diet. I mean, it got to a point where I was looking at sleep habits, diet, behavioral, things at home. I was looking at everything, trying to figure out what can I change in order to get me closer to high jumping 7 feet, right? Weight room, everything, right? So I think I either was coached this way through in growing up, right? I did like 5 sports in high school, either coached this way to think this way or I was born this way. I'm not sure. But then when I found industrial engineering, I said, oh, yeah, this just makes sense. Right. And then when I found lean and continuous improvement, I said, oh, yeah, this just makes sense. Right. So I think God put something in me already. And I just sort of found out how to do it better through my profession, throughout my profession.
But it seems like this product technology business model is a better fit for you. Like, it seems like it's like taking advantage of more of your strengths than you could have if you still, like, let's say you didn't have the feast or famine and you had tons of consulting clients. Like, it just, on the regular, they were showing up on, like a train, a train schedule. All the trains were showing up whenever you wanted them to. But it seems like this particular model suits you better. Like, what is it about this model that's a fit for you that you might not have realized if you didn't have the feast or famine and that led you into this path? Like, what is it about this model that works for you?
All right. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. I'm going to try to do my best to explain. So, like I said, I'm not sure how I arrived at this mindset. I don't know if it's through nature or through nurture, through coaching, perhaps. Could be either way, could be a combination. But I do have a fundamental belief that the best person to solve a problem is the person that's closest to that problem. It's not the consultant that flies in from across the country. It's not the coach even that's maybe they're building discipline. It's the person that's dealing with the problem day in and day out. So one of the things I learned at Carney, I'm gonna give away some secret sauce here as a consultant, is the CEO or some executive leader would say, "Hey, we got this problem. Go ahead and put some scope, some definitions, some context around the problem, and then propose some solutions." And then we did that. We built beautiful decks. In fact, most of the time on site was built building decks, not actually driving improvements, which I felt some kind of way about. Um, but when it came to the recommendations, I simply just took what the people doing the work told me needed to be done and just put those in the deck. A lot of time I didn't tell them what to do because I don't honestly feel like I know. I'm coming from the outside. I don't know the context of that situation. I don't know the politics. I don't know the realities of the process. I don't have a history of issues that have happened throughout the time of doing it, being in business. So the person who does know that is sitting right there on the production line or on the, at the hospital, whatever it is. So for me, I learned that the answers are there. The ideas are there. I don't need to bring that. What I need to bring is the conditions for those answers to bubble up to the power, to the people who can actually effectuate those ideas, right? Um, so I realized, consulting probably wasn't the ideal fit for me. Coaching, yes, to some extent, but this can I build a lot of that my way of thinking into a product and then let people and then give everybody access to their product in such a way that it's not just reserved for rich companies, but also available to medium and small companies, democratizing continuous improvement so that, everybody can play.
But it sounds like you have this ability to create, like, you have the technology background, the engineering mindset, like, it just seems like this particular model, like, pulls on more of your strengths than just pure advising, like, that you're a musician as well, like, so you have that creative side, so it seems like this just kind of plays with more of your skill sets than like, I'll use myself as an example, even though it's like I love creating content. Like, every time I kinda hit a burnout moment, in my career, I'm like, "Oh, I'll make a course," like, "That will solve it," and I'll scale it. But then when I go and, then, like, I get some rest and it's like, "Oh, okay, I this isn't what I'm," people don't really want this for me. People like my branding experience, like, my ability to kinda get in there, and it's like, so, like, a product business isn't really the right fit for me because that's not really what my value proposition is, or it's not necessarily, like, my key strength. But it seems like for you, so I really want you to think about like my audience is some lean people, but there's some of them like parent coaches or um leadership coaches, OD consultants, like they all might want to have this type of business model that you have. What what would you say would make this the right fit for them? Like how would they learn from your example to say, I need these skill sets, and then what would you say is what do they need to know or understand about this type of business model and how it's different in terms of marketing and selling versus like a service-based business?
I
So I
would
guess
say to
those are
be
2
successful.
questions.
Yeah, yeah. I would say to be successful in any type of business, you gotta have the basics, right? You gotta be disciplined. You gotta have be a self-starter. You gotta take initiative. You can't just like wait on somebody to tell you what to do. You gotta wanna see something and be willing to take the steps to do it, but also be willing to take the risk and all those kind of things, right? I would say if you're gonna pick up the tech handle though, um, you gotta right, tech is all logic. So if you're good at math, that's probably a good early indicator that you could build a good tech product, right? Great at math, even is even better because software is all logic. So you're also putting the customer first, right? And understanding that they probably couldn't just cut a check for 50K, 100K, $1 million to go out and hire a consultant or a coach, but they could probably pay a couple grand every month to have a subscription based thing, but you got to pack that thing full of value for them. And you also got to talk to a lot of customers before you build something. Ideally. Now, I'm not always I'm guilty of my own in my own law in a lot of cases, and I've learned my lesson the hard way in a lot of cases. But yeah, you got to be comfortable approaching a lot of people and saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing something. What do you think about it? What problems are you having? What have you tried, or what are you trying to do right now to solve those problems? If I built this, would you be interested in trying it?" Right? Everybody will say, "Yeah, go ahead and build it." Almost everybody will say, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea." Very few people will actually pull out their credit card and pay for it. So you got to be willing to accept that. Again, this is the lesson I learned right out of corporate. Is a lot of people will say they want it and they'll do it, but then the reality is only certain people will do it, actually do it. So it's kind of a ping. It's a PDCA cycle. It's this continuous improvement. Do something, try it out. Do something, try it out. You got to be willing to iterate a lot and give yourself time to iterate and iterate quickly, learn fast. There's kind of a fail fast culture in Silicon Valley. I got mixed feelings about that, right? Especially when you're doing damage while you're failing. You gotta be careful and be mindful, calculated risks, not just, you know, yeah, just smart about the way you proceed. But when you're building software though, you gotta be thinking about scale too, right? So even small problems at scale become big problems. So you got to almost have a little bit of a perfectionist mindset while you have the rapid iteration mindset, right? It's got to,
What about a course?
yeah.
Like, let's say somebody's not a techie person and they don't wanna create a
Okay. Yeah.
technology, but they wanna do the course. Like, I think the real question is how do you know, like, a product-based business is a better model for you versus a high-touch service-based business? And then what does it take to convert a service-based business into a product-based business?
Honestly, I think the first question is what do you feel you can sell better? What's easier for you to sell, right? Because, cash is fuel for whichever way you go, you're going to need cash and you're going to have to keep that business funded. So, but I would say if you love and can't do without that human touch, you got to see people and deal with people and, you know, be in person, high touch contact with the customer. Some people thrive on that and they love that and they want that and they desire that and they can't do business without that, right? Then you're probably more on the service side, right? But if you're thinking on the side of um, I'm a creator, I'm a build great things kind of person, engineering mindset. Like I started this business almost 10 years ago. And every day I'm not thinking, ooh, let me come up with a new product. It's let me add another brick to this house I'm building. Let me add another room to the house I already got. Let me add. So it's kind of a building a skyscraper type of mentality, but the building itself is you love it and you want to see it go out and thrive in the world and bring value to a lot of people, right? If you got that kind of mentality, then you may be more of a product person. So I guess it comes back to what motivates you, what you love, and your ikigai, if I'm saying that right. What you
My
wake up
my
to, what
audience
excites
would
you, get you out of bed
know
in the morning.
most of the people in my audience are like lean people are new to my audience. So you gotta
Yeah.
translate it for the rest of us non-lean people.
So ikigai it's a Japanese term that in short, it's what excites you, what gets you out of bed in the morning, right? It's very oversimplified way of explaining, but it's what can you do, what you want to do, what makes you money, and what the world needs, right? It's like a 4-point star, and in the middle, if you can find something, a way to use your time that checks all four of those boxes, that's your thing. That's your ikigai. So if, like I said, if you just love interacting with people all day long and being in the place and shaking the hands and kissing the babies and all that, you're probably a service-minded person. But if you love building something and sticking with that and perfecting that thing and being married to it for a long time and being dedicated to seeing it successful, you're probably more of a product person.
And it's also like if you were gonna do a mix, like I would say on certain things that are very like I think products, if it's like I need to transfer some new knowledge and skills, Like, then you can do that in a product, but you were even saying is, like, with the product, when I'm transferring knowledge and skills in the system, like, that could work, but when I'm working on the mindset, like, that's more of a coaching type of thing, like, because 'cause you're not gonna
Mm,
nobody's mindset's gonna transform because they went through an online course, like,
mhm,
nobody's
that's
gonna
true.
get more confidence, but they could learn some skills, so if
That's true. Yeah.
I could do a blog writing I could do a blog like, how to write a blog that converts, like, I can make a course on that if I wanted to support my business, but coming up with your big idea, the controlling idea behind your content, like, that's not gonna be in a course, like, that's gonna take some of
That's
that
true.
or even having the mindset of a thought leader, like, that's not gonna be in the course, so I think it's, like, depends too, is you don't necessarily have to go one way or another, but if you're gonna really want a product to work, you really have to kinda, like, commit to it, and I think that's what I learned from your journey is it wasn't like, "I'm gonna build it and magically it's gonna make me $1,000,000 a year." Like, it was like, "I'm gonna keep building it and building it and building it and adding to the house," that you were saying, and brick by brick, and I'm nurturing this thing because I wanna see this happen. And then when the coaching is needed, then you augment it when needed, and I think that's what I really like about the whole thing is, like, it does suit your personality, it suits your gifts,
Mm,
and you nurture it, and you're gonna keep responding to the market. But
that's
since
it,
we've talked
right?
so much about your system, I haven't given you a chance to explain, like, where people can learn more about your system, who should buy it. Can you give us that information?
Yeah, so, I guess in short, we've built a platform and a university. It's 2 sides of it. One, so you can learn the fundamentals and the basics of Lean Six Sigma, continuous improvement, university, even get certified, white, yellow, green, black master, black belt. The other side is to apply what you've learned, and apply is more focused on the application of Lean Six Sigma concepts and principles in your real world work environment. So, kind of to double down on what you said, the product isn't probably going to solve 100% of your problem. That's where a consultant or coach can get you to 100%. But, if it can get you to 70% with almost fully automated, that's still worth a lot, you know? 50% is still worth a lot. 30% is still worth a lot, right? So, and the URL is improver.com. That's IMPRUVER.com. That can take you into the university. You can do a pilot. We have a 10 by 10 pilot, um, 10x return in 10 weeks. We also have a free trial on the platform. It's a 30-day free trial. Takes about 15 minutes a week for about 30 days. And you have a very solid proof of concept for the technology and how you could use it. The other place is LinkedIn. So if you that's easy to find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there as well. Look for Calvin L. Williams.
And your podcast.
That's right. We got the Improvers podcast, and you have been a guest.
I
One of
have.
my favorite, one of my
Yay!
favorite guests, if I must say.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, we try to do something every, more or less 2 weeks. Sometimes faster, sometimes not. But yeah, we bring on thought leaders in the space, people who can help provide a service, provide some ideas to those who are out there trying to improve the world around them.
And your rap album?
Yeah, so the rap album is on Spotify. It's called Calgorithm. So you can see tying the tech with the my name and the music and all that. It's a great piece of work. It's almost a biography, autobiography from birth up to now, really. So but it's very cool. Song after song is all 100% factual, real stories and all that, real people in my life that every song is dedicated to a real person in my immediate life. So very
So
cool project.
you're a true renaissance man. You're like you have, mastery in a lot of different areas. Are you ha do you I'm thinking you must have a side hustle on, like, coming up with fun names where you smush things together. You know, I'm gonna challenge you as this, episode is ready to post that you're gonna come up
Oh,
with some sort of fun name for, like, my branding service or something where you smush my name into something. That would be really funny.
hey, the Michael Jordan of Brandon, Betsy Jordan, right?
Oh, and I am from Chicago, and I do have positive memories
Hello,
of Michael Jordan. I know we do
there
have
you
that in
go,
common.
right? Hey,
Uh,
hey, that works. That works.
so is there anything else you wanna tell me about entrepreneurships, pivoting your business focus, what it takes to
Hmm.
thrive, and I'm just not asking you the right question?
I think it all comes back to continuous improvement, right? You gotta first know what you want. You may not know how to get it, but at least know where you want to be. If you can think longer out, that's great. But if it's just a year, 2 years, 5 years, that's good enough. And try something within your scope of resources and time and what you got. Use what you got to get what you want, and don't give up. That last part, don't give up, is probably the most important. Yeah,
Use what you got to get what you want. Is that a
that's it.
Calvinism?
As of today, right now, yeah, let's go with that.
All right, so I'm gonna make sure that we're gonna have a quote in social media that you're gonna comment on. Use what you got to get what you want. Wait, you tell me it
Heck yeah.
again. Use what you
Use what
got
you got.
to get what you want.
You could go with that one. I tell my kids, I say, you got to flip what you got into what you want. I tell them that too. So yeah,
Ooh,
that'll
I
work.
like both of those. All right, I'm gonna definitely have to lead with that one. All right, you and I could probably chit chat for a long period of time. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show. I highly recommend Calvin as an example if you do want to shift your business. Definitely tap into his mindset if you want to move into more of a product-based business. And I believe that there's transferable principles like for if even if you're not lean, if you are all kinds of coaches, all kinds of consultants, there's lots that you can learn from the whole improver journey. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being on the show. So here's my take on all of this. The real secret to sustainable and scalable success really is about building a business that aligns with your best at strengths and your authentic passions. And that requires you to take yourself seriously and do the work to figure it out. And the other truth that I know for sure is burnout, just like fear, are horrible strategists. Now, I speak from experience. Every time I hit a wall, when I hit some level of burnout, I always had this thought like, oh, I'm going to go and build a course. And once I recovered and got some space and I really listened to my audience, what I realized is that people don't want a course from me. That's not the primary thing they want. They want me. They want my ability to help them untangle their complex ideas and turn them into words and messages and offers and content that connects and converts. So, if you're at a crossroads in your business, whether you're just getting started, ready to pivot your focus, or thinking about doing something like Calvin did, we really need to chat. We really need to make sure that this is the right path for you and it makes the best use of your strengths. So, book a call with me and let's get you to the right business and the right clients faster. I also have a couple other podcasts you might want to listen to help you get clarity on how to make this happen. Definitely go and check out episode 120 if you haven't listened to it, which is all about strategically positioning or consulting or coaching for the right clients, or episode 122, which is all about what no one really tells us about sustaining our success as a solopreneur, consultant, or coach. As we wrap up this conversation, I have a couple of reflection questions and some action ideas for you to think about. Before you jump into creating a course or a program or a technology like Calvin did, I want you to really think about like what your ideal client engagement looks like. And is a course, product, or program really right for you, or is it just a short term fix for burnout? And if you want to test the waters, go for it. I recommend doing low cost probes on everything. Maybe you can create a short video series as a lead magnet, which would give you an opportunity to not just grow your email list, but give you a chance to see how do you feel about creating content. Or if you have a technology idea, test it out with a few people, ask their input. And for sure, talk to people like Calvin who has made this transition. Get curious about what it really takes before jumping in. And it's not just what does it really take to get this thing started, but what does it really take to get those clients or those customers in the case if you have a product, and what does it take to sustain and scale that success? So that's it for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show, hit subscribe, and share it with other consultants and coaches who are seeking the same type of impact and income that you are. And until next time, thanks so much for listening.